ConvertBox ActiveCampaign tracking. In this video, we're going to cover how to start tracking immediately on email submission when that's done using the API. ConvertBox uses the API, and we want to make sure that we're tracking people immediately versus the other options. If you look down at the very bottom, there's three things that ActiveCampaign brings up. When they click a link in a campaign, tracking can start. When they submit a form created in ActiveCampaign, tracking kicks in. That's immediate. Now, the downside is when it goes through a third-party form like ConvertBox, it doesn't typically start tracking. And the way we're going to do that is we're going to inject the email address that ConvertBox collects and push it into the tracking code. Now, there's a link there, IntegratePro.co/ACCB. That will help generate the appropriate code. Now, the downside right now is you cannot use the ActiveCampaign Wordpress plugin. The reason is the JavaScript code they're using in there is a little bit out of date relative to their tracking code. I suspect they'll update it sometime in the future, but for now, it's not available to use. So let's dive right in. Now, first things first, we need to have a ConvertBox that we're going to use on the site. So I'm going to go ahead and create a new one real quick here. Okay, so now we have a ConvertBox set up that's going to fire on every page load all the time, just for demonstration purposes. So next thing we want to do is we want to go into WordPress. Now, let me just show you some things you can and cannot have. So unfortunately, the ActiveCampaign plugin needs to be deactivated if you're using it. The ConvertBox can be enabled or disabled. I'd recommend having it enabled because it's very simple to get the code added to your site. And then you're going to need to have some kind of plugin that allows you to insert code into the footer of your WordPress site. I'm using one called Insert Headers and Footers. Additionally, there's some page builders like Thrive Themes, if I'm not mistaken, that allow you to inject code into the footer. So that's another option. But for this demonstration, I'm simply going to use a plugin that does that for me. So the assumption is you've got ConvertBox set up, you've activated it, you put in the code that you need to, it's ready to go. You do not have ActiveCampaign plugin enabled, and you have some kind of footer plugin that allows you to put code in there. So I'm going to go ahead and go to that because I want to get ready for what we're going to do. Now, in the footer, we're going to need to put the appropriate code. So to start with, we want to go to ActiveCampaign, we want to go to Settings, and I want to go to tracking, and of course you want to make sure your website is enabled for tracking, and then copy the code that's generated down there. And then to this site here, IntegratePro.co/ACCB, drop the code into here, click on Submit, and it's generated some additional code right here. The original code is also down here, but we don't need this anymore. We do need all of this code right here. So go ahead and copy that, go into your WordPress site, go back to the headers and footer section, push that into here, into the footer, go ahead and save that. So that's ready to go. Now the next step is to test it. So on this page here, when I refresh it, the ConvertBox should show up. And before I put my name in there, I'm going to go ahead and search for myself and make sure I don't enter an address I've already used. So I'm going to go ahead and type in an email address that I haven't used before. Now back to here. There's the email I just submitted. Now tracking typically kicks in just, right there it is. And if I was to go to another page on the site, that should also show up in a second. There, so I visited a 2-page. So that's how you enable ActiveCampaign tracking to fire immediately on email submission using ConvertBox.